Test 1 2, check 1 2.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. April Bolton. I'm Dean of the Graduate School here at Hood College. It's a pleasure to see our room slightly filling up. We do want to try to maintain physical space between different parties as much as we can. I think we've got the space to do that. Unless you're up here at the podium, please do remain masked. Please keep your masks up over your nose. We are also asking folks after our lecture is over, if we have a bit of time, we're hoping to have about 10-15 minutes after Dr. Cerf's lecture. We have 2 microphones up there in the middle of the auditorium. If you have a question you'd like to pose to Dr. Cerf, feel free to approach one of the microphones, and at that time, you can quickly unmask if you are comfortable. If not, feel free to let either myself or Mr. Welsh in the back, the blue shirt, he'll be down there as well. You can let us know what your question is so we can pose it to Dr. Cerf. So welcome. We have a great evening planned for you, and as I said, we'll have a few minutes left at the end for any questions. We would also like to extend a special welcome to those who are live streaming tonight's event. We have several hundred folks on YouTube who are joining us virtually, so welcome to you as well. At this point, it is a pleasure to introduce President of Hood College, Dr. Andrea Chapdelaine. Please welcome Dr. Chapdelaine.
Good evening. Welcome to all of you who are here with me and those of you out in virtual land. It's great to have you here. As April said, my name is Andrea Chapdelaine. I'm the proud president of Hood College. 3 years ago, a dedicated alumna and trustee emerita and her husband had a vision for bringing internationally recognized cybersecurity and computing professionals to Hood College in order to share their expertise and global impact with our aspiring computing students and the wider Frederick community. Janet Hobbs Cotton, class of 1959, and her husband, John, funded the Cotton Cyber Lecture Series. They believe that placing a spotlight on this topic through this series is a part of the solution to the significant need we all recognize for cybersecurity professionals we have in this country. I know it has had that impact on our students, as well as those students at Mount St. Mary's and Frederick Community College, where we share a cyber pipeline with. It has inspired them, as well as new students interested in this field, to persevere what is a difficult progression of study and to address this tremendous need we have in our country. This year, the Hood College Graduate School is celebrating its 50th anniversary, the oldest graduate program in this region, currently offering 30 master's degrees, doctoral degrees, and certificates. So tonight's event is particularly celebratory. As we approach the Cotton Lecture Series' 4th year this spring, we already boast an impressive array of speakers, from the first commander of the U.S. Cyber Command and policy expert for 2 former U.S. presidents, to the de facto head of anonymous and multiple NIST fellows. And tonight, we add to that impressive array of speakers by featuring the father of the internet and the college's first Turing awardee, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is the Nobel Prize of the computing world. So it is my great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Vinton Cerf, Vinton Cerf is Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google. He has held positions at MCI, the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, Stanford, UCLA, and IBM. Vint Cerf served as chairman of the board for the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, and was founding president of the Internet Society. He served on the U.S. National Science Board from 2013 to 2018. Widely known as one of the fathers of the Internet, he received the U.S. National Medal of Technology in 1997, the Marconi Fellowship in 1998, and the ACM Alum N. Turing Award in 2004. In November 2005, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In April 2008, the Japan Prize, and in March 2013, the Queen Elizabeth II Prize for Engineering. He is a fellow of the IEEE, ACM, and AAAS, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Computer History Museum, and the National Academies of Engineering and Science. Cerf holds a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics from Stanford and a Master of Science and PhD degrees in computer science from UCLA, and holds 29 honorary degrees from universities across the globe. Before we welcome Dr. Cerf to the podium, I would like to close with gratitude for the vision of this series' benefactor with a quote from Janet Cotton herself, who I hope is out there. Hi, Janet and John. What Janet said is that she and John hope that events like tonight will, quote, encourage all of us to participate and become more aware and educated of the issues in cybersecurity our society faces today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vint Cerf to the podium.
Well, good evening. You know, when people clap before you said anything, you probably should just sit down because it won't get any better than that. So I really, of all the introductions I've had, that was the most recent. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've never been in Frederick, Maryland before. It's about an hour and a half by car from where I live in McLean, Virginia. And I really enjoyed the trip, seeing rolling hills and farmland and things like that, which is pretty different from the suburbs of Virginia. But the thing that really caught my eye as we were driving into the school here was a bus that on the side of it said, "Get ready, Frederick, there's a better internet coming." And I thought, how the hell did they know I was going to be here tonight? I don't know. So I'm not sure what that meant. At least one person tonight speculated it might be 5G. It might be something else. Maybe it's an advertisement for Starlink. I don't know the answer. But the implication is that you need a better internet than you have right now, which suggests the title of my talk, which is The Unfinished Internet. I want to reassure everybody that despite the fact that the internet was designed over 50 years ago, the fact is it's still evolving, and you students who are thrashing around looking for a dissertation topic should have no problem finding something to do because this thing is still not finished, and I hope to convince you of that by the end of the evening. There are a few things I thought you and I could share, though, an example of getting it wrong. Everything that can be invented has been invented. Charles Duell, Commissioner, 1899. That shows a certain dearth of imagination, I would say. And now here's another wonderful one. By 2005, it will become clear the internet's impact on the economy has been no greater than the fax machines. Well, fax is dead, the internet continues. And that was 1998, so the internet by that time had been in operation for 15 years because we turned it on in 1983, did the design work in 1973. Here's the other one. This one is very important, Theorem 206. Everything is more complicated. And if you notice, the more you study something and the deeper you look, the more complicated it gets. The internet is a lot like that. And so that's another thing which is wonderful for students looking for dissertations. The closer you look at this system, the more complicated it gets and the more interesting problems you can surface. Well, let's go back in history for a moment. It's 1969, and the Defense Department has decided to use packet switching to connect time-shared computers to each other. Now, why would they do that? Well, it had little or nothing to do with defense. It had to do with research. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, was funding research in artificial intelligence in the 1960s at about a dozen universities around the United States. And every year, each of the computer science departments asked for a brand new computer so they could do world-class research. And even ARPA couldn't afford to buy a dozen computers back in the 60s. They were millions of dollars. They had to be outfitted in air-conditioned rooms. And they said, we can't afford to do that, but we're going to build a network so you can share each other's resources. And by the way, since we're going to fund all of you, please share your results with each other so we can accelerate the pace of the research as opposed to having you hide things in order to have an edge on next year's proposal. So I was a graduate student at the time, and my job was to connect the Sigma 7 machine to the first interface message processor. Is that a serious problem, and should we? So yeah, let me know if that means we should evacuate the room. So I was supposed to connect the Sigma 7 machine to the first interface message processor of the ARPANET. You know, the Sigma 7 is in a museum now, and some people think I should be there too, but here I am. So our job was to build this little 4-node network, and it worked. And this was very exciting because packet switching, which is a lot like electronic postcards, was not the norm for telecommunications. Telecommunications was an old topic. Remember the telephone system, 1876 or so. So circuit switching was the way that worked. And that was a slow process. Dial a number, wait for a connection, send some data, hang up, dial another number. The computers wanted to spit data back and forth at each other at much higher speeds than that. So packet switching was our way to make it work. So that actually was quite successful. It expanded rapidly in the research world, sponsored by DARPA. And eventually it actually managed to make its way over to Europe as well. So on the 25th anniversary of the ARPANET, Newsweek decided to help us celebrate. So my colleagues, John Postel, Steve Crocker, and I spent 8 hours putting this photo shoot together because we had to go and get the yellow squash and the green zucchini and the 5-pound tin coffee cans, and we strung all that stuff together. Our purpose was to show how primitive networking was way back in the day. Now, if you look carefully at this, you'll see the geek joke. You notice that it's ear to ear and mouth to mouth. This network would never work. There was no mouth to ear. And we thought we would pose that way for the geeks who were reading Newsweek magazine at the time. Well, let's fast forward now. Bob Kahn and I started working on the internet design in 1973. I remember he came out to my lab at Stanford and he said, "We have a problem." And I remember thinking, what do you mean, we? And he said, well, the ARPANET has worked very well. The Defense Department now wants to use computers to assist it in command and control. But the implication of using computers for command and control was that they would be in ships at sea, in aircraft, and in mobile vehicles. The ARPANET was designed and built on top of dedicated telephone circuits connecting the packet switches to each other. Today you'd call those routers. But you can't use wires to connect the tanks because they run over them and the wires break. And the airplanes never make it off the tarmac and the ships get all tangled up. So Bob had already started working on a mobile packet radio system that was to be deployed in the San Francisco Bay Area, and a packet satellite system over the Atlantic connecting the western part of Europe to the eastern part of the US, with multiple ground stations sharing a common satellite channel, kind of like an Ethernet in the sky. So all three of those networks were built during that period, 73 to 1977. By this time, I'm here in this area. I'm running the program for the Defense Department. I'm the program manager for the Internet program, and I want to show that it works. And so we put this little demonstration together. We had a packet radio van driving up and down the Bayshore Freeway in the San Francisco area, radiating packets at 100 kilobits a second, going through a gateway. We didn't know they were supposed to be called routers. We called it a gateway linking two networks. So we ran the traffic through the gateway up in the upper left there, and it went all the way through the ARPANET through an internal synchronous satellite hop to a ground station in Goonhilly Downs, and then by landline to University College London, and then escaped out of the ARPANET through another gateway into the packet satellite network and went all the way back across the Atlantic to the United States, the east coast of the US, and then back into the ARPANET and then down to Los Angeles, where it landed at USC Information Sciences Institute. Now, the distance between San Francisco and Los Angeles is about 400 miles. The packets went 100,000 miles to get there because they went up and down through two synchronous satellite hops and back and forth across the Atlantic and the United States, and it actually worked. And I remember leaping up and down thinking, it works, as if it couldn't possibly have worked. Listen, if it's software, it's a miracle when it works. So as the program manager, I was really happy that we were able to do that demonstration. Well, fast forward a few years into the mid-1980s, and you discover the National Science Foundation says, hey, maybe this packet switching isn't so crazy after all. We have 5 supercomputers that we're building, and we want all of the research universities in the United States to have access to them. Let's build a network. What kind of network should we build? Well, those guys over in the Defense Department have this thing. It's running TCP/IP, and it looks like it works. So they decide to build their own NSFNet backbone. Then they take advantage of the fact that the architecture of the internet was intended to allow lots of different networks to be interconnected, arbitrary numbers of them. So they also built a dozen intermediate area networks to interconnect. In this area, it was called SuraNet. And they allowed these different networks to serve different institutions. So by having these dozen different intermediate level networks, the intermediate net would serve a bunch of universities, and the guys running the NSFNet backbone only had to worry about 12 customers, those 12 intermediate nets. And they increased the bandwidth from 1.5 megabits a second to 45 megabits a second, and eventually ranging up into 2.4 gigabits per second during the course of NSF's lifetime, which began around 1985 and ended in 1995 when they shut the network down. Now, in the meantime, the Department of Energy said, oh, this looks like a good idea. We're going to build a backbone too, and they did. The Energy Sciences Network, which is still running, and it has advanced in its data rates up to now 800 gigabits per second per channel. So we're getting close to a terabit per channel on optical fiber, which is astonishing. And NASA, not to be outdone, says, well, we need to do that too. We'll connect our laboratories together with the NASA Science Internet, and that too is still running. So even though the ARPANET is long gone, the packet radio network is long gone, the packet satellite net is long gone, NSFNet is long gone, the internet survives because it's not a particular network, it's an architecture, it's a concept, it's a set of standards and a set of protocols. So this is the way the internet looks now. And I'm cheating a little because this was actually a picture from 1999. We looked at the person who put this together, looked at the routing tables for all of the networks to see how they were interconnected. And for each color, each network was a different color. So the point that I want to make with this slide is that there literally are 76,000 different networks that are part of the internet. And they are each are operated independently of each other. They each decide what hardware they're going to buy, what software they're going to use, who they will connect with, and under what terms and conditions. And the whole thing still works. And the only reason that it does work is that they've all adopted the same TCP/IP protocols and other underlying mechanisms that make it interoperable. So this is a highly distributed system. It does not have any central control. The only thing that is centralized about this system is the allocation of Internet Protocol addresses so that they're done uniquely. You don't give the same address to two different parties. And the domain name system, which is equally, has to be unique. You assign a domain name to only one party, not more than one. And there is now an organization that was created to do that. It's called the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which I had the honor of chairing for some 8 years. So the whole point here is that the system, which is now, of course, global in scope, runs primarily because there is a cooperative and collaborative element that makes it work. What I find really astonishing is that some 80% of the connections, interconnections that are made are on a handshake deal. It's not even a contract. People don't charge each other for the exchange of traffic. It's simply a peering arrangement, although there are also paid peering arrangements for somebody who has perhaps a small physical scope and is connected to somebody with a very large physical scope. The difference in investment suggests that the smaller party is getting more benefit than the bigger one, and so there's some charging that's done for that. So now let's talk a little bit about the unfinished business in the net, because it's clear from the headlines that you read and the things that you study here at Hood University that there are some serious problems associated with the implementation of the internet and its use today. And I'm going to go into some detail later about the Internet of Things, but let me just start by observing that if we're going to use software to drive devices, which is what the Internet of Things is about, think a little bit about the desirable properties of those devices that you would like. You would like them to be reliable. You'd like them to be safe. You'd like them to preserve your privacy. You'd like them to be secure. You'd like them to interoperate across different brands of products. You certainly don't want to buy a bunch of things and have them not interwork in your house. And finally, you want autonomy in the following sense. Nobody wants a house that stops working when the internet connection goes away. So these devices are going to have to run even if the internet isn't present. And that is part of the requirement. Now, I also mentioned artificial intelligence and machine learning, and I would argue that the same set of desirable properties applies to machine learning as much as they do to the Internet of Things. So we'll come back to that with some scenarios of the IoT space that I would especially like the students here to think a little bit about, because there are dissertation topics hiding in that space. The second bullet here is familiar to every one of you, and that's because we've seen that this platform, this astonishing global everything is connected to everything platform, has lowered the barrier to access to information and its production and discovery. That was very much intentional. The whole idea and belief was that if we lowered those barriers, that people would be able to share information with each other and to build possibly new businesses and new applications in this uniform and global platform. But the problem is that when you drop the barrier to nearly zero, everybody gets the benefit of that, including people who don't have your best interests at heart. And so the bad guys have as good access to the internet as the good guys do. And that includes the distribution of misinformation and disinformation. We don't have good solutions to that. You hear people saying, what about machine learning? Can I use artificial intelligence to filter the bad stuff and keep the good stuff? I think the answer is that we are not yet, I am not convinced that that is the answer to the problem. It may be part of the answer, but it certainly isn't all of it. So the last point on that line is critical thinking. And here I'd like to suggest that the best filter that we could possibly have is the wetware up here. We need to teach people to think critically about what they're seeing and hearing. Where did this come from? Is there any corroborating evidence for the claims that are being made? What might have been the motivation for putting this information into the net for me to discover? We need to ask those questions. Now, it turns out that that takes work. Not everybody is willing to put the work in to think critically about things. But if you appreciate science, which I suspect every single person in this room does, you know that critical thinking is the essence of science. You have theories. You make predictions from the theories, you make measurements, and you try to figure out whether the measurements reflect the predictions of the theory. And if the measurements don't, you have to be prepared to give up your favorite theory in favor of a better one that explains the measurements. Now, I have a theory about Nobel Prizes. I want you to imagine for a moment you're a scientist and you have this theory and you've decided to do a measurement. So you plot the graph and then you start doing the measurements, and every single one of those measurements matches exactly the graph that you predicted, except for this point over here. Well, there's two kinds of scientists. There's one that looks at that point and says, measurement error, I'll ignore that. Then there's the guy that says, that's funny. When he finally figures out what that point is doing there, that's the guy that gets the Nobel Prize. So I hope that you will agree with me that we need to do more critical thinking, and we need to teach people, our kids and ourselves, how to do that in order to deal with misinformation and disinformation. It won't solve all the problems, but it's a start. And that leads to the third bullet, which is just more general digital literacy. Look, we teach kids, look both ways before you cross the street. We do that to keep them from getting run over, even though the rules are you're not supposed to run over people, but we look anyway just to make sure in case somebody doesn't follow the rules. So we need digital literacy with regard to the online environments that we enter into when we're online. And that also includes recognition that the software that you might be using in whatever device you happen to be employing may have bugs in it and not work the way it's supposed to. You need to know that. You need to be aware of the fact that things may not work as expected, and you need to be prepared to recover from that if you can. That leads to another problem that the internet enhances in some sense. And when it was designed, when Bob Kahn and I started doing the work, we thought about how would we build the addressing structure? How would we identify endpoints in the network? And one possibility would have been to use what we did in the telephone system. Well, we didn't do that, other people did that, but what was done in the telephone system. I'm not that old. I know, it looks like it, but we said, let's not do country coding. Let's just use the topology of the networks and the way they were interconnected as a way of addressing them. So each network had an identifier, and every device on each network had another identifier associated with it. So any host on any network could say, I want to send stuff to that network, that host on that network. So this is a purely topological addressing thing. And there was actually a rationale for that. Remember, we're doing this for the Defense Department. And I remember thinking through the scenario, okay, well, what if we did the other thing where we use country codes? And I can imagine, okay, so we're planning to attack country B in a couple of weeks. And so we have to go to them and say, can we get some internet address space from you so we can run our command and control system when we attack you 2 weeks from now? That didn't sound like it was a really good plan. So we dropped the idea of using country codes. They reappeared again in the domain name system, and all of you know .us, .fr, .de, and so on. But that is above the level of the internet addressing structure, which is below the domain name system. So this gets us back to the international law problem. Because the internet is fully connected, anyone, anywhere, can attack anyone else anywhere. And the consequence of that is that the victims may be in one jurisdiction and the attacker in another. The only way we're going to deal with problems like that is to agree on an international basis that we will cooperate to track down people that are doing harm on the network. That is going to require serious global international agreement. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, recognized this. By the way, he's an electrical engineer, which is very cool to think an EE guy is running the United Nations. I mean, something sweet about that. In any case, he started a project called Digital Cooperation. And so I was able to participate, was lucky to participate in the development of a proposal to start working on digital cooperation for things like this. How do we deal with law enforcement in a global environment? And we are going to need that. And there's still a lot of work to be done to negotiate what the terms and conditions are for helping each other track down bad behavior, badly behaving people. Another thing which came up over dinner tonight, and it must come up for every student who's studying cybersecurity. The reason that we have a cybersecurity problem in part is that we don't know how to write software that doesn't have bugs. And this is kind of embarrassing considering that we've been programming computers for 80 years. Now, I haven't personally, but maybe 50. But the fact is that in that 80-year period, we still haven't learned how to design and build software that has no bugs in it. So that's a serious research problem, something I've been encouraging students who are inclined in that direction to consider. How do I design and build program development environments that will expose the stupid mistakes that we tend to make? And believe me, they are very stupid. If you've ever met any programmers, you may notice a lot of them have a little dent right here in their forehead. This is from going, God, how could I do something so stupid? So I have my little dent here. We really need to work on that problem. And that's a fantastic dissertation topic, whether it's the programming environment or the programming language or the way in which we analyze the software. And that leads to the last bullet on this chart, which has to do with ethics and software-based systems. It's my view that it is unethical to write software which is known to have bugs. It is unethical to distribute software that cannot be updated to fix bugs. It's wrong to allow that kind of thing to happen, and that's an individual ethic and a corporate ethic. So we see people increasingly studying ethics, but often it's attached to AI and machine learning. I'm here to tell you that that ethical dilemma is not just about machine learning. It's not just about AI. It's about software in general. And so I hope that some of the students here will remember that that too is something they need to take away from their research and studies. So let me shift now to another big problem about the unfinished internet, which is it isn't everywhere that it needs to be, and we sometimes call that the digital divide. And there are reasons why the internet isn't where it should be, or not available where it should be, or it is inadequate for purpose. Sometimes it's available, but it doesn't do what you need it to do because it doesn't run fast enough or it's too expensive. There may be no physical facilities. Oh, by the way, electricity is usually pretty helpful in running networks and computers because they don't do very well without those electrons. I remember being in San Diego a few years ago at the Marconi Society annual event. We were making our annual $100,000 prize award to a Marconi fellow. And at UC San Diego, we were having a conference like this one. And at some point, I remember offhandedly saying, you know, we're all focused on radio and Marconi and everything, but, you know, electricity is even more fundamental. 2 hours later, all the power went out in San Diego. And it stayed out for 2 days. It turned out somebody had been doing a maintenance procedure in Arizona and skipped a step, and it created a cascade failure that went all the way across to California, down to the Mexican border, and up to towards Los Angeles. After all the power came back up and everything else, I got an email from someone who had been at the conference saying, you know, you really didn't have to do that to make the point. And I remember wanting to send a note back saying, I just wanted you to know I could do that. There may be other reasons, though, why we don't have internet where we would like it to be. As I say, economic barriers cost too much. There may be policy inhibitors. There are some governments that see telecommunications as a piggy bank. And so they don't want competition. They want to have government control over that. That's becoming less and less common, but it was very common in the past. So sometimes policy gets in the way of getting more internet out there. Or maybe there isn't a policy which encourages competition, for example. And then finally, there may not be people available to actually build and operate it. And that turns out to be really important because, you know, you don't parachute in and build something and leave and expect it to run. You need to have people who are locally capable of operating these things and users like you and me who are digitally literate and able to use the technology. This was a big surprise for me as I'm looking at the digital divide. I've been watching the undersea cable activity. It is astonishing. I have never anticipated seeing this much cable development as has happened, including connecting islands in the middle of the Atlantic and the Pacific. Companies like mine at Google are actually building their own cables now. I mean, we contract out, but we pay for a cable instead of having to find a partner, which used to be the case because they were so expensive. Now it's possible to build and operate your own cable. Of course, it's true, we're a big company and we are able to afford that. So more and more cables are being built. That's exciting. And then there's this other thing, which I'm sure you're all well aware of, and that's low Earth orbiting satellites. So you get Starlink, which is farther along than anybody. O3b is not quite low Earth orbiting, it's medium orbits, around 8,000 kilometers. And OneWeb and Cooper are two others that are underway. So you see the hairy ball there is Earth, surrounded by 42,000 satellites. I have to admit, I have this image of the Starlink where they get the last 24,000th satellite up, and the first one they send up just falls out of the sky, and then they have to launch some more. But Elon Musk, bless his heart, has a perfect business model. He has SpaceX to launch the satellites, so when they start falling out of the sky, he just launches another one. So he's got a very good self-fulfilling business model. That's very important because it may be, if they succeed in getting all those low Earth orbiting satellites up, that it will be impossible to escape access to the internet because these things will reach every single square inch of the globe, including the seas. And one thing I'm very happy about is that means that we'll get to the South Pole with serious capacity. Why do we care about that? Turns out the National Science Foundation has an experiment there called, guess what, the ice cube. It turns out they've drilled 5,000 holes in the ice. They put detectors in those holes, and they're looking for interactions with high-power neutrinos that are coming from outside the galaxy. And they need the ability to transmit data back so that people can analyze what's going on. And so having something like Starlink or the others will be a big help because right now they have very low data rates. By the way, the physicists there do have a sense of humor. When they detected an extremely high-power neutrino, it was like 12 tera electron volts, they called it BERT. And then they found another one and they called that Ernie. And then a 28 tera electron volt neutrino showed up and they called that one Big Bird. I kept wondering, would they shut down the experiment when they ran out of Muppet characters? Well, I mentioned that we were going to talk about the Internet of Things, so let me just say that we are at the point now where there are an increasing proliferation of programmable devices. And they are range from picture frames to light bulbs. I used to say, someday every light bulb will have its own IP address. Well, you know what? That's not funny anymore. There are light bulbs with IP addresses in them and little speaker systems that you can talk to and they talk back. I like the guy with the internet-enabled surfboard. I guess he got bored sitting out there on the water waiting for the next wave, and he said, okay, I'll put a laptop in my surfboard and I'll put a Wi-Fi service at the rescue shack, and while I'm out there waiting for the next wave, I can be surfing the internet. So it's a real product. So, there are a bunch of scenarios that, I won't go through all of these, but imagine, how about a refrigerator that's internet-enabled? Well, what would you do with an internet-enabled refrigerator? Well, if you had an RFID chip or something on everything you put in the refrigerator would know what it has inside. So you could be off at work or at school, and it could be surfing the net, finding recipes that it can make with what it knows it has inside. So when you get home, you would see a list of all the recipes you could have. And then the Japanese have spoiled the whole picture because they invented an internet-enabled bathroom scale. And so you step on the scale and it figures out which family member you are based on your weight, and it sends that information to the doctor and it becomes part of your medical record. And that all seems pretty reasonable except for one problem. The refrigerator is on the same network. So when you come home, you start seeing diet recipes coming up on the display. Or maybe it just refuses to open because it knows you're on a diet, bad. Now, the other great invention that I'm so excited about is the internet-enabled sock. And imagine you've got little RFID chips in your socks, and you can send out an SNMP packet in order to find the missing sock, and it responds, I'm under the sofa in the living room. So we've solved the problem of the missing sock, and I think that is a major contribution to humanity. There are lots of other possibilities here, including that last one, the self-driving cars, which are a reality. I have been driven in a Waymo car in Arizona. And after, it takes a while to get used to it, and I think I left my fingerprints in the back seat for a while. But these cars are pretty remarkable. This one drove us around for about half an hour, came to an intersection where there was a flashing yellow arrow, which I had not seen before. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but the car figured out it meant you can make a left turn as long as there's nobody going to run into you. And it made the left turn successfully. So I've come away believing that it's possible to have self-driving cars. The people who live in the region don't like it, though, because they're kind of very cautious cars, and then people get impatient waiting for the car to decide that it's okay to make a turn. So I warned you that I was going to dive a little deeper into IoT. Part of the reason is that it's related to cybersecurity and safety. And there are a lot of slides, and I won't go through all of them. But remember that list of things that I mentioned earlier about desirable properties of these devices? Well, here, that's that list again. You certainly don't want devices that simply have a high probability of working. I mean, a light switch that you have to flip 6 times until it turns the light on. And you certainly don't want something that isn't safe in your house, and nor all of these other things. So I think that we need to be conscious of the fact that if we're going to design devices that are programmable and are networked, that we need to keep all of that in mind. Whoops. Now, some people have an overly simple model of how to build an IoT device. They think, okay, mobile phone, Wi-Fi, device, done. Well, it turns out it's a little bit more complicated than that, because most of the time it's not just one device. It's a bunch of devices. Some of us just did a little test at Google. We sent notes around and saying, how many internet-enabled devices do you have in your house? And some people came back with 30 or 40 of them. I wasn't quite that many, but I did find a few in a sock drawer that I had forgotten were still there, and they were radiating the temperature in the sock drawer. So we need to see this as a system. And if you're in the computer science world, in this computer security world, system-level thinking is super important. It's not just one thing, it's lots of things interacting. So the question is, what happens if somebody shows up in your house and your system detects that there's another IoT device, like maybe it's the repair guy? Are you supposed to ingest that into the system or not? How do you know whether you should or not? What if you got a software update? How do you know if it's coming from the right source? How do you know whether it has integrity? That is to say, somebody didn't change it while it was on its way from the source to your updated device. We need cryptographic digital signatures and other kinds of strong authentication to make that work. What do we do about maintaining interoperability? What if you put up a new piece of software and it stops working? We've seen a few examples of that. Not to pick on anybody, but Facebook had a little problem the other day where they configured things in such a way as to cut themselves off from the rest of the universe. And I don't make fun of this. It's not easy to figure out when you've misconfigured something. And in this case, they clearly discovered that kind of in a dramatic way. So another thing which is interesting is that the devices ought to be instrumented so that we can tell if they're performing properly or not. And you may even need, because they're small little devices, you may need something between them and the big unwashed internet in order to filter and defend them against attempts to attack. Some of you will be familiar with an attack by about 500,000 webcams that had no security in them at all. And so they were turned into a giant botnet. They were sending megabit per second streams to a single target. Dyn Corporation knocked it over several years ago, which wouldn't have been so bad, except Dyn Corporation was doing domain name service for a whole bunch of important companies, and so they disappeared off the internet as well because of that. And that's all because somebody had built webcams with no security or with a username and password that couldn't be changed and was well known. So a good example of a bad idea. So here's a bunch of other things. Suppose that you've got 100 devices in your house, and you sell the house, and a person moves in with another 100 devices. So the question is, how do you configure 200 of these things? And the last thing in the world you want to do is to be spending the entire week typing IPv6 addresses into some configuration system. And imagine if you're using IoT for manufacturing, you've got tens of thousands of these. So scaling is important. So we're back to it's not just one device, it could be tens of thousands of them. Here's another problem. A bunch of people live in the house, parents, kids, guests, maintenance people. How does the system tell them apart, and how does it know which ones have what authorities? That's actually a hard problem. And do you have to hang little chips around people's necks so that the system can tell which person are they, and what if they steal the parents' one? Actually, the kids probably know more than the parents do about how to avoid everything anyway. So this is a big issue of figuring out how you should distinguish among authorities of people using collections of IoT devices. Now, let's imagine for a moment that you have a bunch of webcams, and the fire alarm system has just detected a fire. So the fire department is on the way. You might want the fire department to have access to the webcam so they can see if anybody is, unconscious, or can they see where the fire is burning. After the fire is out, though, you don't want the fire department to have access to your webcams anymore. So we have to figure out, how do we do this episodic access under the right conditions? Same argument for the police department, for example. So I just see quite a wide range of challenges associated just with this one manifestation of programmable devices. Again, worthy of a lot of searching. Now, we mentioned security, which is a big topic here at the university. I tried to get the guys doing the Android operating system to change the name to Paranoid, because I thought it would convey to people that we were concerned about access control, and they said they didn't think that would sell very well, so we didn't do that. But there are a long list of things that we can and should do in order to protect these devices from invasion, or from mistakenly offering control to something that doesn't belong to them. So strong authentication using cryptographic methods and digital signatures is very important when they're first configured and installed in an operating environment. So I'm going to skip through here. I think I've already mentioned the ethical constraints earlier today, so I won't go through this again, except to emphasize again how many ethical issues are associated with software production, and why it's so important for us to insist that companies and individuals who write software for our use be conscious of those ethical considerations. Standards are also super important because they're the thing that makes things interoperate. We would like to see standards among all of the IoT devices, different brands interoperating with each other. You don't want to have separate sets of controls for different brands of these devices. You want everything to interwork just like it more or less does on the internet. So again, these standards are very important. So we're going to get billions of these devices, whether we like it or not. They're already on the way. Some won't work the way we want them to before or after they get installed. Some won't have any support after we're installing them. Some may not meet any of our desired properties. So there's a lot of work here to create an environment where the manufacturers of these things are focused on meeting some of those desirable properties. And sometimes you simply have to enforce that by regulation. It's just like cars can't be sold here in the US that don't have seat belts. And if you're driving without a seat belt and you're caught, there are consequences. We may need to see similar kinds of things happen with the IoT space. Now, recognizing that I want to leave time for some questions, and I've already run a little past that, I did want to mention two other activities that I'm involved in now. One of them is called the Interspecies Internet. And if you go to interspeciesisinternet.io, you'll see the webpage. Several of us started this work in 2013. Our theory was that animal cognition is actually significant. It varies, of course, from species to species, but certainly in primates and, frankly, birds, elephants, dolphins, things like that have evidence, show great evidence of cognitive capacity. So we're very interested in the possibility of two non-human species being able to interact with each other. Certainly we have examples of humans interacting with non-human species. The problem is that they're often not co-located, so the internet is simply a tool for moving information back and forth between otherwise not co-located non-human species. However, it turns out the internet, because of all of its computing power, might also be useful for helping to transduce some of the vocalizations or other signaling of one species into something understandable by another species. This is still very much an exploratory activity. There are a couple of hundred people now who have been studying these things for many years, studying cognition in non-human species. And so we have an annual 2-day meeting, and you'll see more about that if you go to the website. Then the other thing I thought you might be interested in is the Interplanetary Extension of the Internet. That project got started in 1998, just after the Pathfinder landed in 1997. Now, some of you will remember that the Viking landers arrived in 1976. That was a really big deal, and 2 of them successfully arrived. And then for 20 years, nothing worked. Everything, either missed the planet or smashed into the planet or whatever it was, didn't work. 97, finally we landed something successfully on Mars. So I flew out to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the spring of '98 and met with the team that was responsible for the software for the Pathfinder project. Now, since that time, since 1997, a lot of successful landers have arrived. They put up the reconnaissance orbiter and Mars Express, which was sent to map the surface of Mars so we can figure out where the rover should go. And they are still in orbit after all these years. Meanwhile, we had Phoenix and Spirit and Opportunity in 2004, the Science Laboratory and Curiosity, most recently Perseverance, and the Ingenuity helicopter. So there's been a lot of tremendous success. Now, let me tell you what happened. This little group of us got together in '98, and we said, what should we be doing in 1998 that we're going to need 25 years from now? And we concluded we should start designing an interplanetary extension of the internet to support manned and robotic space exploration. So we started that work. In 2004, in January, Spirit and Opportunity landed on Mars. And they were intended to transmit data back to Earth through what's called the Deep Space Network at the blazing speed of 28.5 kilobits a second. The Deep Space Network consists of 3 70-meter dishes, 200 and some odd feet, and Canberra, Australia, Madrid, Spain, and Goldstone, California. So now, of course, the scientists are mildly grumpy about 28.5 kilobits a second, but that's the best we could do from the surface of Mars with the size antenna and power we had available. So they turn on the radios and they overheat. So the engineers say, wait a minute, and they say, let's back off on the duty cycle, don't want to fry our electronics for the radio or the other sensing instruments. So now the scientists are really grumpy. And somebody said, well, wait a minute, you know, there's this X-band radio on the rovers, and the orbiters have X-band radios. Why don't we reprogram, remember this is 250 million miles away, why don't we reprogram the orbiters and the rovers? So the rovers will take the data and they'll hang on to it until the orbiter gets overhead and we'll sort the data up, and the orbiter will hang on to the data until it gets to the right place in its orbit to transmit data back to the Deep Space Net. You know what that is? That's store and forward. Guess what that is? That's packet switching. So instead of point-to-point radio links, all the data that's come back from Mars has been packet switched since 2004. So we got very excited about this prototype software operating in 2004 and in subsequent landers since then. We have been developing and standardizing interplanetary protocols. So when we started, we thought, well, TCP/IP works on Earth, so it ought to work on Mars. What's the problem? Then we started doing the math, and we discovered that the distances between the planets is astronomical. And so you know, really, it takes 3.5 minutes at the speed of light to get between Earth and Mars when we're closest together. It's about 35 million miles. And when we're farthest apart in our orbits, it's 235 million miles. It takes 20 minutes for a radio signal at the speed of light, and of course, double that to go back. Now, here we are thinking, hey, the internet's working great. What do you use for that? Well, we use TCP and IP. So how does flow control work? Oh, it's really easy. The TCP thing says to the guy on the other end, I ran out of room, stop sending. Well, if it takes a few seconds or milliseconds or something for that signal to get there, it works. What if it takes 20 minutes before the other guy knows that you don't have any room left? So all this data comes flying back and it lands on the floor and the wind blows it away or the dog eats it or something. So we said, okay, that's not going to work. Then we had another problem. The planets are rotating and we don't know how to stop that. And so if you're talking to something on the surface of Mars and it rotates, you can't talk to it till it comes back around. And the same problem with the orbiters. So we said, oh, okay. So in the interplanetary environment, we got different parameters than we had on the Earth-based internet. And so we are now faced with a delay and disruption tolerance problem. And we ended up designing a whole new suite of protocols that take that into account. We call it the bundle protocol. And we've now standardized that. And it works very differently than the internet world does. For example, domain name resolution. In the internet, basically, you want to go to the www.google.com. Well, the internet doesn't know how to go there. It only knows how to go to a numerical address. So you look it up in the domain name system, and you get back an IP address, and then you go there. That's great. Now you're on Mars. You want to talk to something on Earth. So you do a domain name lookup. It takes 20 minutes to get there. It takes another 20 minutes to get back the address. And by that time, whatever it is moved to a different address because it's a mobile. And so it doesn't work. So first you have to figure out what planet are you going to before you decide how to get to the computer at the other end after you get to the right planet. There are several other things about the bundle protocol that have been required. Oh, here's a good one. Network management. Now, some of you may have heard the word ping. Ping is a special word for echo this packet. And in the internet, usually that's a very brief moment. If you ping a host and it sends a note back, you know it's there. What if it takes 40 minutes and you're not even sure if it's actually going to answer? What if it's a multi-hop thing and it'll take days to get there? So real-time interaction is not your friend in the design of a network management system. So we've had to redesign all of that stuff. So at the moment, we have various implementations of the bundle protocols, some of them running on Android, some of them running on mobiles, some running in laptops, and Raspberry Pis and things like that. We have collaboration between NASA, ESA, JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, and CARI, the Korean Space Agency, are all in the process of working together to test and deploy these protocols. This year, we actually put the ION is the JPL version of the bundle protocol. It's running on Google Cloud, on Azure, and on the AWS cloud-based systems. The software is freely available. At the moment, it'll be on GitLab soon. It's already been on SourceForge. So our plan now at the Interplanetary Networking Special Interest Group of the Internet Society is to start deploying some terrestrial-based tests with these protocols, inviting the general public. Some of you may remember the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Do you remember SETI at home was a little program you could download, and it would read the radio signals and then look for something that looked like it was coherent, and then it would raise its hands and say, I found somebody. Nobody ever raised their hands, but they kept looking. I asked them, why are we doing search for extraterrestrial intelligence? And they said, well, we didn't find any intelligence here, so we're looking out. So the IPN-SIG, the Interplanetary Networking Special Interest Group, is planning to deploy something we'll call Solar System Internet at Home, SSI at Home, to let the general public help us test the bundle protocols at scale. There's a report. By the way, these slides are freely available, so if you want to make them accessible to the general public, you're free to do that. So if you go to our website, ipnsig.org, you'll see our report about how we can see over the next 100 years the evolution of an interplanetary backbone. And of course, now that we figured out how to do the interplanetary thing, the natural next thing to do is how do we get to Alpha Centauri? And so it turns out that's only 4.3 light years away. That's about 26 trillion miles. And the current propulsion systems would get us there in about 76,000 years. which is a little long for an experiment. And then there's this little navigation question, how do you get there? If you think about it, when we do interplanetary navigation, there's usually a mid-course correction or three, right? So we signal and we get back, and, where are you and how are you going, and here, please do this burn. Imagine that you've got a spacecraft that's 1 light year away, so it takes a year before you can get it to say anything, and it takes another year to find out what happened. It's not exactly interactive. So we're going to have autonomous navigation in order to get to Alpha Centauri. Then there's this last little problem. How do I send a signal back from Alpha Centauri to Earth? And let's be ambitious, and let's use lasers, because they go faster than radio does. So you have this little problem. Imagine that you're in orbit around Alpha Centauri, and you've got this data that you want to send back to Earth. So you have to figure out which direction to point the laser so that by the time the light beam gets there 4.5 years later, it actually lands where the antennas are or where the telescopes are. That's an interesting problem. How do I calculate the location of Earth 4.5 years from the time that I try to transmit the data? So we wisely went to people who are smarter than we are, and this was at the Lincoln Laboratory, which is a spin-off from MIT. And we asked them, how far away are we, not how many light years, but how far away are we in capability to actually launch a mission that might take only 100 years to get there? That was our target. And so they went through the entire panoply of design challenges and everything else, and came back and said, you are 53 dB away from being able to do anything useful. Let me translate. That says that we're 100,000 times away from where we need to be in terms of the parameters that have to be achieved in order to mount such a mission. So this ain't going to happen in my lifetime, most likely. But you know what? It's fun to think about stuff like this. I feel like I'm in the middle of a science fiction story, and I get to at least be around for the chapter 1 and 2, even if I'm not around for chapter 25. Well, that's the end of my prepared remarks. I thank you for your time. I'll answer questions. I realize I've pushed the limit here, but if you want to hang around, I'm game for a chat. Thanks very much. So we have microphones in the back there for people.
So we have a microphone. We have time for 2 or 3 questions. So if you want to try to line up and ask a couple of questions. Dr. Cerf has had a phenomenal day, long day, so let's respect his time too. Let's go ahead, kick it off.
If you want to take your mask off, that might help. Or maybe you have to turn the microphone on. There is that little small detail.
Thank you. It was very delightful. Your first 3 slides and your last 3 slides have something in common, which is the investment had to be made by a public entity. I mean, there was nothing big enough that could make the initial steps. Later on, obviously, everything had to be managed privately, and it seems that a distributed system avoided what's commonly known as the tragedy of the common. I mean, everybody cooperated to make it work. But the reality is that if you really look at it in terms of accessibility, equity, et cetera, it hasn't really worked super well if you look at that globally. So do you think that it's time to revert a little bit for a public interest in building infrastructure for the internet?
Is this working? Yes, there we go. So honestly, I sometimes dream about starting all over again. What would it look like if I had a blank sheet of paper? And there are several people who have tried that, by the way. There are efforts by research agencies like the National Science Foundation and some standards bodies to try to do that. There are some tough challenges with trying to do a redesign. You can do the design. The question is, can you deploy it? because will it be backward compatible? Probably not. So how do you build something that's different and new? It's not impossible because that's what we did the first time. That's what internet was different from the telecommunications circuit switching system. But figuring out how to do that and to deploy it on a broad basis may turn out to be tricky, but it's not impossible. So to give you an example, we used the ARPANET as the scaffolding to design the internet. And so you can imagine using the internet as the scaffolding to design something else. And there are proposals that look a lot like that to reimagine what the internet looks like. So, so the answer is it might be possible to do that, and I would not turn away from an attempt. But getting it deployed will probably mean a significant investment. And now we need incentives. This gets past the technology and into what incentives will there be for people to make the investment to do the deployment and to use it. So it remains to be seen, but it's not a crazy idea at all. Okay, yes, sir.
Hello. So you talked about the unfinished internet and the current research that still needs to be done. I had an idea of I've been thinking about what to pursue in the future, and I've thought that if you wanted to have essentially a very large impact, you'd have to focus on humanity's total happiness with you, minus a world without you. And two things you would probably want to pursue from that is something that's very important relative to happiness, and two, something that wouldn't have been done without you. So if you think about it within a cumulative subject like science, math, or computer science, or something else, if it were to be added up, if it were to be done somewhat eventually, how much could you pull that time forward because you were born? And do you think of something like that to choose what problems you work on, since there are so many of them? And how many years do you think it would have been for someone else to develop the internet?
I have to be honest and tell you that I didn't hear everything that you said. I'm hearing impaired and I wear hearing aids. And you were not unclear, but I didn't hear the question as clearly as I would like. Can I get a little help? We'll see if this works. If it doesn't, I'm getting off the stage and running over where I can lip read if I have to. Yes?
I'm going to summarize best I can. I'm a biologist, so you're going to have to forgive me, because I'm probably not going to get it entirely right. But he was basically asking, in terms of your place, how long do you think the internet would have, how much longer would it have taken for the internet to be discovered, developed, had you not played a part in it?
Oh, in other words, if we hadn't done it, would somebody else do it, and what would it look like? So, well, there is one answer to that. There was an alternative architecture called the Open Systems Interconnection Model, which work began in 1978 on that in Europe at the International Standards Organization, just as I was freezing the TCP/IP protocols at ARPA. And so for 15 years, we had this battle between us, who was going to win the international standards contest. And by 1993, partly thanks to Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web, which accelerated the adoption of the internet dramatically, OSI did not succeed and TCP/IP did. But I think networking was in the air. And so if Bob Kahn and I had not done this and did not have the resources of the Advanced Research Projects Agency behind us, somebody else might have done something too. So I don't know whether we accelerated it necessarily, but it's nice to think that we succeeded in getting this thing out there in people's hands, even though now we look at it and say, gosh, there's still a lot of work to be done. It's still unfinished, and I hope you'll help us finish it.
Wonderful, thank you.
Sure.
Let's have one final question.
Thank you very much. That was a great talk. Really enjoyed it. And I think one theme that I saw throughout it, as well as that I've seen in advertisements I see around and thoughts that I've had as I've seen technology grow from what it was to where we are now, is that the technology grows a lot faster than the policy that we have to direct it, and that definitely came up in terms of when you talked about ethics, when you talk about briefly IPv6 versus IPv4. I mean, we still see that going, maybe never full switch over. can you think of any important steps that would really be helpful to really get us going in the right direction and finally get policy up to speed?
First, you're right. Policy tends to be very sluggish when it comes to reacting to technology, and it sometimes reacts rather badly because assumptions get made. For example, we hear, fix all the algorithms and all the problems will go away. And you know, I'm sitting here thinking, well, do you have any idea how those algorithms actually work? And the answer is, well, isn't it kind of like a recipe? And the answer is, well, it used to be, if you remember rule-based systems in the AI world, if then else, and lots of hundreds of rules like that. But now the algorithm is basically 17 million parameters in a giant multi-layer neural network. And if somebody says, how does it work? You point at this thing and you say, well, there's all these numbers here and they all get, they interact with each other and the answer comes out. And that's the algorithm. And you know, I remember being in the House of Lords trying to respond to this, and they had a lot of trouble accepting that it was that obscure. So let me come back, though, to the basic idea here. We should not base policy on specific technology. What we need is, what is it that we want the policy to achieve? What are our objectives? And one of them is going to be safety for people. Another is security. Another is privacy. Another is reliability. All those things that I wrote down, affordability and so on. What we want is to adopt policies that create incentives for achieving those results. And if we can help the policymakers move along those lines and not worry so much about the specific technology, then we may actually get to the point where we have policies that are workable. It's a little bit like the decision that was made in the internet design. The internet layer of protocol has two very peculiar properties. The first one is that the packets don't know how they're being carried. Nowhere in the internet protocol spec do you say that it's going over a wire, a laser link, an optical fiber, or something else. We said, we don't care. And that was important because when somebody invented a new way of communicating, we could just sweep it into the architecture because the packets didn't know. It's like a postcard, doesn't have any idea whether it went on a bicycle or an airplane or a boat. The other property that packets have is they don't have any idea what they're carrying. They think it's a bag of bits, but they don't know what they mean. And that's a good thing because since the network doesn't know what the bits are in the what the bits mean, it means that you don't have to change the network when somebody adds a new application. Those bits are interpreted at the edges of the net. So imagine now, I don't know if we can make sense here, but imagine policies that have properties like that, that are not so dependent on specific technology, not so dependent on particular applications, but are built around basic principles. If we can achieve that, which is a non-trivial exercise, then maybe we will be able to help policy keep up with the transitions in technology. So I think we'll wrap up for tonight, but thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to meet you, and I hope I'll see you on the net.